Tuesday morning, Willow Creek Estates. A crew showed up with sledgehammers. They were tearing down my backyard bridge. Neighbors gathered, phones out, whispering. I just stood there, arms crossed, smiling. Something about my calm made people nervous. The HOA president kept checking her phone. She had no idea what was coming. My name is Mark Delaney, and for 11 years I've lived in Willow Creek Estates with my wife Sarah and our daughter Lily. We're not troublemakers. We mow on time, pay dues, wave at neighbors. I just happen to own the one backyard with a creek running through it. That creek came with a small wooden footbridge, built by the original developer before the HOA even existed. It connects our yard to the community greenway trail. Lily used to fish off it. I repainted it every spring. It was, in every sense that mattered, part of our life. Deborah Ashworth became HOA president 2 years ago, after a campaign built entirely on restoring standards. She measured mailbox heights with a tape measure. She once fined a widow for leaving her Christmas lights up until January 3rd. People called her Debbie behind her back, never to her face. First, Debbie left my bridge alone. Predated her tenure, predated most of the board, and honestly predated the HOA's own architectural guidelines by nearly a decade. I assumed history alone would protect it. That assumption, I'd later learn, was the first mistake I made about Debbie. The trouble started, oddly, with a garden gnome. Sarah bought Lily a ceramic frog for her 9th birthday, and we set it by the bridge. Debbie photographed it during one of her neighborhood compliance walks, and emailed us a violation notice within 6 hours. We laughed. The notice cited, unauthorized decorative structure in common adjacent space. I pointed out the bridge sat entirely on my own lot, per my deed survey. Debbie's response was 2 words, under review. I didn't know yet that under review was Debbie's favorite phrase for things she intended to destroy anyway. At the next HOA meeting, Debbie brought up aging wooden structures as a safety concern, never naming my bridge directly but staring at me the entire time. Linda, the treasurer, asked which structures she meant. Debbie said, "We'll circle back," and moved to the next agenda item without answering. I started noticing Debbie's car slow rolling past our house on her morning walks. Phone raised, clearly photographing the bridge from different angles. Sarah joked that we should charge her admission. I laughed too, but some part of me had already started keeping my own folder of emails, just in case. Our neighbor Tom Reyes, 2 houses down, mentioned he'd seen Debbie out there with a clipboard one Sunday, pacing off distances near the creek bank. Tom worked some kind of engineering job he never fully explained. He just said, "Keep records, Mark. People like her always overreach eventually." I didn't think much of Tom's warning at the time. He was quiet, precise, always jogging at dawn with a small notebook in his pocket. I figured he was just another retiree with opinions. I had no idea how much that notebook, and Tom himself, would eventually matter to us. Debbie's compliance letters kept coming. One for the bridge's peeling paint, one for unpermitted creek access, one for structural liability exposure to the community. Each cited a different HOA bylaw, sometimes bylaws that contradicted each other. I answered everyone calmly, in writing, always keeping copies for myself. At a block party that August, Debbie cornered me by the drink table. "That bridge is a lawsuit waiting to happen," she said, not quite smiling. "For the good of the community, I'd hate for something to happen to a child." I asked if that was a threat. She just sipped her lemonade. I went home and pulled our closing documents from when we bought the house. The plat map showed something curious. A thin dashed line running along the creek, labeled with initials I didn't recognize. I photographed it and filed it away, not yet understanding what those initials meant. The HOA sent a final notice, demanding I remove the bridge within 30 days or face escalating fines. I hired a local surveyor to walk the property line. He confirmed the bridge sat on my land, but he also flagged that dashed line on the plat, calling it worth checking. Worth checking how? I asked him. He shrugged and said older developments sometimes carried recorded easements the county never bothered updating in the HOA's own paperwork. He recommended I request the original recorded plat from the county recorder's office instead of trusting the HOA's internal map. I filed the request that same week, mostly out of stubbornness. Meanwhile, Debbie escalated things at the next board meeting, reading my history of non-compliance aloud to the room like a prosecutor. Gary, one of the newer board members, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Nobody ever said anything to Debbie. Sarah started losing sleep over it. Lily asked why the bridge lady kept sending us letters. I told her it was just paperwork, nothing to worry about, but I could feel my own patience thinning. Debbie wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She'd made this bridge personal, and I didn't know why. I found out why from Linda, who called me quietly one evening. Years earlier, before I owned the house, Debbie had tried to buy our lot from the previous owner specifically for its creek frontage. The sale fell through. Never really let that one go. That explained the intensity, but not the recklessness. Debbie wasn't just annoyed about a missed real estate deal. She was building a case, methodically, letter by letter, like she intended to win something bigger than a mailbox dispute. I started to wonder what winning even looked like to her. The county recorder's office told me my request for the original plat would take 4 to 6 weeks. I hated waiting, but I had no choice. In the meantime, Debbie's letters kept coming, each one slightly more aggressive. Each one signed, "For the safety of our community," like a slogan. At the September meeting, Debbie proposed a formal vote to authorize remediation of unsafe structures near common areas, without naming my bridge specifically. Ron, the newest board member, asked for clarification. Debbie said the language was intentionally broad for flexibility. The board approved it 3-1. I left that meeting with a knot in my stomach. Broad language, I knew, was exactly the kind of thing people like Debbie loved. Vague enough to justify almost anything later, specific enough to point at me the moment she wanted to. I started backing up every email to a second folder. 2 weeks later, Debbie showed up at my door personally, clipboard in hand, and informed me the board had voted to remove the bridge for community safety within 10 business days. I asked for the vote minutes in writing. She said she'd get to it and walked back to her car. I called the county recorder's office again, pushing for an expedited copy of the original plat. The clerk, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, seemed to take genuine interest once I explained the situation. She said the dashed line I'd photographed looked familiar and promised to prioritize my file. 10 days came and went, and I let myself believe common sense had won. Then, on a random Tuesday, a work crew showed up at 7 in the morning with a truck, sledgehammers, and a laminated printout of an HOA authorization letter signed by Debbie Ashworth herself. I hadn't received any updated notice, any final warning, any confirmation of timing. Debbie stood on the sidewalk in a windbreaker, directing the crew like a general. I asked to see the actual board resolution. She waved a single sheet of paper at me and said, "It's all approved." Sarah came outside in her robe, furious, demanding they stop. Lily watched from the window, confused and scared. Neighbors started drifting out onto their lawns, drawn by the noise of hammers already striking wood. I felt something in me go very quiet and very focused, the way it does before a storm. I did something that surprised even me. I told the crew to go ahead. Sarah stared at me like I'd lost my mind. I pulled out my phone, started recording, and said quietly, "Let them finish. I want this on camera, start to finish, every single swing." Tom Reyes appeared at the property line within minutes, notebook already out, timestamping everything he saw. He didn't say much, just nodded at me once like we'd silently agreed on something. I didn't understand yet why a retired neighbor cared so much about documenting a bridge demolition. Debbie noticed the phones out and softened her tone for the crowd, calling it a routine safety remediation. Nothing personal. I said nothing back. I just kept filming as the crew pried up the first plank. The old wood splintering with a crack that seemed to echo across the whole cul-de-sac. By the time the crew finished loading the debris into their truck 2 hours later, the bridge Lily had fished from for years was a pile of broken boards in a dumpster. Sarah was crying quietly. Debbie was already walking back toward her house, clearly satisfied, clearly finished with us. I wasn't finished with anything. I called Patricia Nguyen that same afternoon, gave her the exact date and description of what had happened, and asked how much longer the plat records would take. She paused, then said something that made my pulse jump. "Actually, I have it right here." Patricia read the recorded easement description over the phone. The dashed line on the plat marked a county-maintained drainage and pedestrian easement running the length of the creek, established decades before the HOA's own governing documents existed. The bridge, and the land beneath it, belonged to the county, not the HOA. I sat in stunned silence for a moment. Debbie hadn't just overstepped her authority over my private property. She'd authorized the destruction of county infrastructure on county land, without a permit, without notice, and without any legal standing whatsoever to order it removed in the first place. Patricia explained that unauthorized alteration or destruction of a county easement structure could trigger both civil penalties and, depending on circumstances, a public infrastructure damage claim. She asked if I had documentation of the demolition. I told her I had 2 hours of continuous video, time-stamped, from multiple angles. She asked me to email everything I had immediately, and mentioned she'd loop in the county's Public Works Enforcement Division. I hung up the phone and just sat there for a long moment, feeling something shift in my chest. Not triumph exactly, more like the ground finally leveling out. I texted Tom Reyes to thank him for documenting things on his end, half joking that we might need his notebook someday. His reply came back fast. "Already sent my notes to Patricia this morning. We've been coordinating for 2 weeks." I should probably explain who I actually am. It turned out Tom wasn't just a retired jogger with opinions. He was a semi-retired county land use surveyor who still consulted part-time for public works. He'd recognized the easement markers on our creek bank months earlier and had quietly begun tracking Debbie's compliance letters, suspecting exactly this outcome. Tom admitted he hadn't wanted to alarm me prematurely, since accusing an HOA president of overreaching on county land was a serious claim to make without proof. So he'd waited, watched, and let Debbie's own paper trail build itself, letter by letter, meeting by meeting, until it was undeniable. That night, Sarah and I sat at the kitchen table going through every email Debbie had ever sent me, cross-referencing dates against Tom's notes and Patricia's easement description. A pattern emerged that neither of us had noticed before. Debbie had escalated fastest whenever the board seemed close to questioning her. I forwarded the entire video, every email, and the plat description to Patricia the next morning. She confirmed receipt and said Public Works would open a formal inquiry into unauthorized destruction of a county drainage structure. She also asked, almost gently, whether I wanted to notify the HOA board myself first. I decided I did. The other board members, Linda, Gary, even Ron, deserved a chance to see the truth before the county came knocking. I drafted a calm, factual email, attached the easement documentation, and sent it to the entire board that evening. Linda called within 20 minutes, her voice tight with disbelief. She said Debbie had told the board the demolition was fully authorized by the county months ago. Linda had never seen a permit. Nobody had. Debbie's word. The way boards often do with confident, controlling people. Gary texted me separately, asking if I planned to sue the HOA. I told him honestly that wasn't my goal. I just wanted the truth on record and my bridge, or something like it, restored properly by whoever actually owed it. Gary went quiet, then said, "This is bad, Mark. Really bad." Debbie, for her part, went silent for 2 full days, which for her was unusual. Normally she answered emails within the hour, if only to correct someone's grammar. Her silence felt less like guilt and more like planning. I should have recognized that pattern by then. I was starting to. On the 3rd day, Debbie called an emergency HOA board meeting, closed to residents, citing a legal matter requiring privacy. Linda told me afterward that Debbie opened the meeting by insisting the county inquiry was a misunderstanding, and that she personally would handle it directly, without board involvement. Linda pushed back, asking to see the original authorization Debbie claimed to have from the county. Debbie produced an email that, on closer inspection, was from a general county information inbox, not Public Works, and said nothing about approving demolition. It was, at best, wildly misread. At worst, fabricated context. Ron asked the obvious question, why had the board voted on broad remediation language back in September instead of naming the bridge directly, if everything was already so clearly authorized? Debbie deflected, saying legal matters required flexible wording. The room, Linda said, got very quiet after that. Patricia called me the following week to say Public Works had completed its initial site assessment. The easement was confirmed. The destroyed structure was confirmed to have sat entirely within county-maintained right-of-way, and the case was being escalated to the county attorney's office for potential enforcement action. She also mentioned something new. Records showed Debbie had submitted a change of address filing years earlier attempting to informally claim a portion of the same easement adjacent to her own property, a request the county had denied. Debbie, turned out, had wanted creek frontage for herself all along. That detail rearranged everything for me. This was never really about my mailbox, or my gnome, or safety concerns. Debbie had wanted access to that creek for years, been denied by the county, and apparently decided that destroying my bridge was the closest she could get to controlling it anyway. I mentioned this theory to Sarah, who pointed out something I'd missed. Debbie's own backyard, visible from our kitchen window, had a half-built dock frame sitting near her fence line, unfinished, weathered, clearly stalled for lack of legal access to the water she didn't actually have rights to. The neighborhood, meanwhile, had started talking. Someone posted the demolition video, minus identifying details, in the community Facebook group, asking why the HOA had torn down a bridge without proper notice. Dozens of comments piled up within hours, many from residents citing their own run-ins with Debbie's compliance letters. Debbie posted a lengthy response defending her decision, calling the bridge a long-standing hazard, and accusing unnamed residents of spreading misinformation to undermine community leadership. It didn't land the way she hoped. People had photos of their kids fishing off that bridge going back a decade. A woman named Cheryl, 3 streets over, commented that Debbie had fined her for a birdbath the same week she authorized the bridge demolition without board notice. Another neighbor mentioned a fence dispute where Debbie had personally measured his property line at 6 a.m. with a laser tool. The pattern people were describing wasn't new to me anymore, but seeing it laid out publicly, comment after comment, made something click for the wider neighborhood too. Debbie wasn't just strict. She built a small, quiet empire of selective enforcement, and almost nobody had compared notes until now. The HOA's management company, a third-party firm the board technically answered to, reached out to me directly, saying they'd received the county's inquiry letter and wanted to understand the situation independently of board communications. I sent them the same documentation I'd sent Patricia. They went quiet fast. 2 days later, the management firm sent a notice to the entire HOA board, myself included as a resident, stating they were pausing further enforcement actions related to the creek easement area pending resolution of the county's inquiry. Debbie, notably, was not copied as the sender of that notice. I started to sense the ground shifting under Debbie in a way she couldn't fully control anymore. For the first time since this began, the paperwork itself was working against her instead of for her. I almost felt a flicker of sympathy. Almost. Billy crying over the bridge. Patricia called again to walk me through next steps. The county attorney's office wanted a formal statement from me, along with copies of all HOA correspondence. She also mentioned, carefully, that unauthorized destruction of a county drainage structure could carry restitution costs, and possibly personal liability for whoever authorized it. I asked what personal liability actually meant in practice. Patricia explained that if the county determined Debbie acted outside any real authority, and the HOA's insurance declined to cover an unauthorized act, the cost could fall on Debbie individually rather than the association. That detail felt significant. I didn't say anything publicly about that possibility, but I noticed Debbie's tone shift over the following days. Her Facebook comments got shorter, more defensive, less confident.
She stopped mentioning community safety and started using phrases.
Linda texted me privately that the board had requested Debbie provide every document she'd used to justify the demolition, formally, in writing, for the HOA's own legal file. Debbie reportedly asked for a few more days to compile everything. Linda said it felt like watching someone stall for time. Meanwhile, Tom Reyes had quietly reached out to 2 other public works colleagues who remembered the original easement negotiations from decades earlier, back when the neighborhood was first platted. One of them still had physical file copies in storage, predating most digital county records by nearly 20 years. Tom forwarded me a scanned copy of those original 1990s negotiation notes, in which the developer explicitly granted the county a permanent easement for creek maintenance and pedestrian access in exchange for approval of the subdivision. The bridge had been built specifically to satisfy that agreement, not as decoration. That detail mattered enormously. It meant the bridge wasn't just accidentally sitting on county land, it existed because the county required it as a condition of the neighborhood's approval decades earlier. Removing it wasn't just an overreach. It was arguably a violation of the subdivision's original development terms. I sent that document to Patricia, who forwarded it to the county attorney's office the same day. She told me, off the record, that this kind of clear historical paper trail rarely showed up so cleanly in these cases, and that it significantly strengthened any enforcement action against whoever ordered the demolition. Debbie, apparently unaware of how deep the paper trail now went, doubled down at the next open board meeting, telling residents the bridge removal was a difficult but necessary decision, and that certain homeowners were exaggerating the situation for personal gain. She still hadn't named me directly. She didn't need to. Gary finally spoke up publicly at that meeting, asking Debbie point blank whether she'd known the creek area was under county easement before authorizing removal. Debbie hesitated, just for a second, then said she'd seen conflicting information, and made the best call available at the time. The room noticed the hesitation. After the meeting, Ron approached me in the parking lot, visibly shaken. He said he'd voted for the September broad remediation language because Debbie assured the board she'd already cleared everything with the county beforehand. He hadn't questioned it. That was, he admitted, the actual problem all along. I told Ron I didn't blame him personally, but I did think the board needed to start asking harder questions instead of trusting Debbie's word by default. He nodded slowly and said something I wouldn't forget. We kept letting her be the only one who talked to the county directly. That single sentence explained almost everything. Debbie had positioned herself as the board's sole point of contact with outside authorities for years, meaning nobody else ever independently verified her claims. It was a quiet, patient kind of control, built letter by letter, meeting by meeting, exactly like her enforcement style. For a short while, things went strangely calm. No new compliance letters arrived. Debbie stopped walking past our house with her phone raised. The county investigation moved slowly through its official channels, and life in the neighborhood settled into an uneasy, watchful quiet that felt more tense than peaceful. Sarah started sleeping better, though she still flinched whenever a truck engine idled nearby. Lily asked if the bridge would ever come back. I told her the county was figuring out what happened, and that sometimes doing the right thing takes longer than it should. But it usually still happens. I used the quiet weeks to organize everything methodically, every email in chronological order, every video clip labeled by timestamp, every document Tom and Patricia had shared, all backed up in triplicate. I didn't know exactly what I'd need it for yet, only that I'd probably need all of it eventually. Patricia called with an update. The county attorney's office had formally opened a case file and scheduled a site inspection to assess the cost of restoring the drainage crossing to code. She warned me these processes moved slowly, sometimes months, and asked for patience while the paperwork worked its way through channels. I appreciated the honesty, even if the timeline frustrated me. Sarah pointed out that slow and thorough was exactly what we wanted here. A fast, sloppy resolution could let Debbie spin the outcome later. Better a solid case built carefully than a quick win that fell apart under scrutiny. During this lull, Cheryl from 3 streets over reached out privately, asking if I'd be willing to compare notes on Debbie's enforcement pattern. She'd started keeping her own folder after our public Facebook exchange, and wondered if others in the neighborhood might be sitting on similar documentation nobody had connected yet. We ended up hosting a small, informal gathering at our kitchen table, me, Sarah, Cheryl, and 2 other residents who'd had their own run-ins with Debbie's letters. Laid out together, the pattern was undeniable. Selective enforcement, inconsistent bylaw citations, and a habit of targeting anyone who'd ever declined her requests. One resident, a quiet man named Alan, mentioned Debbie had tried twice to convince him to sell his lot's rear acreage to the HOA for a community amenity expansion, years before targeting my bridge. Both times he refused. Both times, compliance letters about his property increased noticeably in the following months. The picture forming wasn't just about one bridge anymore. It was a long, quiet history of Debbie using her position to pressure homeowners who'd said no to her personal interests, disguised each time as neutral community enforcement. Nobody had ever compared their stories out loud before this moment. I asked Tom, carefully, whether county records might show other instances of Debbie attempting to acquire easement-adjacent land informally. He said he couldn't access personal filings without cause, but promised to mention the pattern to Patricia, since a documented history of motive could matter if this ever became a legal proceeding. Patricia later confirmed, cautiously, that Debbie had filed at least one other informal boundary inquiry years earlier involving a different creek-adjacent lot. Before that, owner sold and moved away. It wasn't proof of anything by itself, but it fit the pattern everyone in that kitchen had already started to see clearly. By the end of that quiet stretch, I no longer felt like a single homeowner fighting one unfair decision. I felt like part of something larger finally catching up to a pattern that had gone unchecked for years, simply because nobody had ever put all the pieces side by side until now. The calm ended abruptly when Patricia called to say the county's site inspection had confirmed significant damage, not just to the bridge itself but to the creek bank grading, which the demolition crew had disturbed with heavy equipment far beyond what any permitted removal would have allowed. The estimated restoration cost, she said, ran into the tens of thousands of dollars once erosion control, grading, and structural rebuilding were factored in. The county intended to pursue that cost from whoever authorized the unauthorized work. That meant either the HOA collectively, or Debbie personally, depending on the board's own findings. Word of the estimate spread through the neighborhood within days, and the tone shifted sharply. Homeowners who'd stayed quiet before started asking pointed questions at HOA meetings about whether their dues might rise to cover Debbie's mistake. Nobody wanted to pay for a fight they'd never voted for. Debbie tried to reframe the cost as a community investment in creek restoration, but the framing fooled almost no one this time. Someone in the meeting asked directly why the community should pay for a demolition Debbie had personally ordered without a proper vote or county authorization in the first place. Linda, visibly exhausted by the mounting pressure, proposed a formal internal review of Debbie's decision-making authority, separate from the county's investigation. The motion passed unanimously, including, notably, Debbie's own vote, likely because refusing would have looked even worse in front of the increasingly skeptical room. The internal review committee requested every document Debbie had used to justify the demolition, plus a full accounting of who else had known about the plan beforehand. Debbie produced a folder that, on inspection, contained mostly her own emails to herself, time-stamped just days before the demolition, oddly self-referential. One email in that folder, dated the night before the crew arrived, reads simply, "Confirmed with county, proceed as planned." When the committee asked which county official had confirmed this, Debbie named a general customer service line, not Public Works, not the recorder's office, not anyone with actual authority. Patricia, when asked directly by the review committee, confirmed no one in Public Works had ever approved, discussed, or been contacted about the demolition prior to it happening. The confirmation Debbie claimed simply didn't exist in any county record. It was, functionally, a story she'd told herself and then acted on. That revelation landed hard in the review meeting. Gary reportedly asked Debbie directly whether she'd fabricated the authorization. Debbie insisted she'd been confident it would be approved eventually, and had merely moved ahead efficiently. Efficiency, apparently, meant destroying county property on the assumption permission would arrive after the fact. Ron, visibly angry now, pointed out that the September broad remediation vote had been based entirely on Debbie's false assurance of county approval. If that assurance never existed, the vote itself had been obtained under false pretenses, which meant the board's own authorization might not even hold up legally. The committee tabled further action pending legal advice, but the damage to Debbie's standing was already visible. Board members who defended her instinctively for years now sat in uncomfortable silence whenever she spoke. Trust, once broken this plainly, didn't rebuild itself in a single meeting, no matter how she framed it. Debbie, sensing the shift, tried a new tactic, appealing directly to residents through a mass email, defending her years of selfless service, and framing the entire situation as a personal attack orchestrated by one disgruntled homeowner with a grudge. She meant me. Say my name. The email backfired almost immediately. Cheryl replied all with a screenshot of her own birdbath violation notice, timestamped the same week as the bridge demolition. Alan replied with his acreage story. Within an hour, the thread had become an accidental public archive of Debbie's enforcement pattern, visible to the entire HOA distribution list. Debbie tried to delete her original email, but the management company's server had already archived it per HOA record-keeping policy, a policy Debbie herself had pushed through 2 years earlier to catch other residents' rule violations. The irony wasn't lost on anyone still paying attention in that group chat. I stayed mostly quiet through this public unraveling, letting the neighborhood's own accumulated frustration do the talking. Sarah asked why I wasn't jumping in to defend myself against Debbie's disgruntled homeowner comment. I told her the documentation already spoke louder than anything I could say in an email thread. Patricia called with the next update. The county attorney's office had drafted a formal notice of violation, naming both the HOA and Debbie Ashworth individually, citing unauthorized destruction of county infrastructure and demanding a restoration plan within 60 days, along with reimbursement for county investigation costs already incurred. The notice, once received by the board, triggered an emergency session. Linda called me that night, her voice a mix of exhaustion and disbelief, saying the HOA's insurance carrier had already flagged the claim as likely excluded from coverage, since the demolition had never been properly authorized through legitimate channels. That meant the HOA, or Debbie personally, could be on the hook for the full restoration cost, with no insurance safety net to soften the blow. Linda said several board members were now openly discussing whether Debbie should be removed from her position before the situation escalated any further. Debbie, according to Linda, reacted to this news not with an apology but with anger, accusing the board of abandoning her after everything she'd done for this community. She reportedly threatened to sue the HOA herself if they attempted removal, which struck everyone as a strange threat from someone facing county penalties. I started to notice a pattern in Debbie's behavior under pressure. She never actually addressed the facts, only the emotional framing around them. Every accusation became a personal attack. Every consequence became persecution. It was less like accountability avoidance and more like she genuinely couldn't process being wrong. Tom mentioned, during one of our porch conversations, that he'd seen this exact behavior pattern before in other land use disputes over his career. People who'd built their entire identity around being the one in control, and who experienced any real accountability as an existential threat rather than a fixable mistake. That framing helped me understand Debbie a little better, though it didn't make me feel sorry for her. Understanding why someone does something isn't the same as excusing it, especially when the consequences of her control obsession had landed squarely on my daughter's favorite fishing spot and my family's peace. The board scheduled a formal vote on Debbie's removal for the following month, per HOA bylaw requirements for officer recall. Debbie, in response, began quietly reaching out to individual homeowners, apparently trying to secure enough sympathetic votes to survive the recall before the meeting even happened. She visited Alan's house personally, according to him, offering to reconsider his old acreage dispute if he'd support her at the upcoming vote. Alan told her, politely but firmly, that he'd already spoken with the internal review committee about the timing of her past requests. She left without saying much else. Cheryl reported something similar. A surprise visit, a sudden offer to waive a lingering fine, a request phrased as neighborly kindness but functioning as a transaction. Cheryl declined and told Debbie exactly why, pointing out that fairness applied retroactively only when someone's job was on the line felt hollow. Word of these visits spread quickly through the same channels that had once carried Debbie's compliance letters. The neighborhood group chat, once a place for lost pet notices and yard sale announcements, had become an informal witness network, cataloging every attempt Debbie made to quietly buy back support before the recall vote. I didn't receive a visit myself, which didn't surprise me. Debbie seemed to understand, on some level, that nothing she offered could undo what had already happened to us. Instead, she avoided our street entirely, taking a longer route on her morning walks that conspicuously skirted our entire block. Patricia called again with a detail that shifted things further. The county's investigation had uncovered that Debbie's demolition crew wasn't even a licensed contractor,
but a landscaping outfit she'd hired informally, off the books, paid partly from HOA reserve funds without a documented board approval for the expenditure.
That detail meant Debbie hadn't just misused her authority over land she didn't control. She'd potentially misused association funds without proper approval, which under the HOA's own bylaws required board sign-off above a certain dollar threshold. The internal review committee added financial misconduct to its growing list of findings. Linda pulled the HOA's financial records and confirmed the payment, nearly $4,000, categorized vaguely as grounds maintenance, authorized by Debbie's signature alone. No purchase order. No board vote on record. It was the kind of quiet financial shortcut that, alone, might have gone unnoticed for years. Gary, reviewing the same records, found two more similarly vague payments over the prior year, both under the individual signing threshold that would have required board approval. Both paid to vendors with only Debbie's personal endorsement. Whether coincidence or pattern, it painted a picture the board could no longer ignore. The board voted to freeze Debbie's independent spending authority pending a full financial audit, effective immediately. Debbie, according to Linda, didn't attend the vote in person, citing a scheduling conflict that nobody quite believed. Her absence, more than any statement, seemed to confirm how thin her position had become. I felt, for the first time since the demolition, something closer to vindication than anger. This had never really been just about my bridge. It was about a system that had let one person accumulate unchecked authority for years, simply because nobody had ever bothered to check her math until it was too late. Sarah asked if I felt bad for Debbie at all, watching her unravel this way. I told her honestly, no, not because I wanted her to suffer, but because every consequence she was facing traced directly back to choices she'd made herself. With full information available, if she'd simply chosen to check it. The recall vote arrived 2 weeks later, held in the community clubhouse. Standing room only, more residents present than any HOA meeting in the neighborhood's history. Debbie sat at the front table, composed but visibly tense. flanked by board members who no longer met her eyes when she spoke. Linda opened the meeting by reading the Internal Review Committee's findings aloud. The false county authorization claim, the unlicensed demolition crew, the undocumented HOA fund spending, and the pattern of enforcement actions targeting residents who'd previously declined Debbie's personal requests regarding their property. The room stayed almost eerily quiet through the reading, the kind of silence that comes from people finally hearing, all at once, a story they'd only ever known in scattered pieces. When Linda finished, she asked if Debbie wanted to respond before the vote. Debbie stood, took a breath, and began. "I did what I believed was right for this community," Debbie said, her voice steady but strained. "Maybe I moved too fast on paperwork. But everything I did because I care about this neighborhood more than anyone in this room." A few scattered residents actually applauded. Most did not. Cheryl stood up from the audience, uninvited but unstoppered, and asked simply, "Then why did you lie about county approval instead of just waiting for it?" Debbie didn't have an answer that satisfied the room. She repeated the word, confident, a few more times before trailing off entirely. The recall vote passed by an overwhelming margin, well beyond the bylaw threshold required. Debbie was removed as HOA president effective immediately, though she retained her position as a general board member per the bylaws, unable to be fully expelled without a separate, more extensive legal process the board hadn't yet pursued. Ron was voted in as interim president that same night, a choice that surprised nobody given how visibly he'd pushed back on Debbie's claims throughout the review. His first act as president was to formally authorize full cooperation with the county's ongoing investigation, without any further internal delay or obstruction. I left the clubhouse that night feeling lighter than I had in months, though I knew the county's restoration case against Debbie personally still hadn't concluded. Removing her from the presidency was accountability, but it wasn't restitution. The bridge was still gone. The creek bank was still torn up. Patricia called the following week with a significant update. The county attorney's office had decided, based on the internal review findings and the fabricated authorization claim, to pursue the restoration costs from Debbie personally rather than from the HOA collectively, since her actions fell outside any legitimate association authority. That meant Debbie, not the neighborhood's shared dues, would be responsible for the tens of thousands of dollars required to restore the creek crossing to county standards. Patricia said this outcome was relatively rare, but the paper trail, Debbie's own emails, the fabricated approval, the unlicensed crew, made it unusually clear-cut. Debbie, through a lawyer she'd apparently hired quickly, sent a formal letter to the county disputing personal liability, arguing she'd acted in her capacity as HOA president, and that any consequences should fall on the association, not on her individually. The county's response, according to Patricia, was blunt and unmoved. The letter cited the Internal Review Committee's own findings, that Debbie had exceeded any authority actually granted to her, based the entire demolition on a fabricated county confirmation, and spent HOA funds without required board approval. Acting outside your authority, the county noted, doesn't transfer the consequences onto everyone else. Debbie's lawyer reportedly requested a settlement conference to negotiate a reduced restitution amount. Patricia said the county was open to discussing payment terms, but not to reducing the underlying finding of individual responsibility. Debbie, seemed, would be paying for this mistake for a long time, one way or another. Word of the county's decision spread through the neighborhood almost as fast as the original demolition video had. For many residents, this felt like the moment the story finally resolved the way it should have from the beginning. The person who'd caused the damage would be the one paying for it. But Debbie, even now, wasn't finished. Stripped of her presidency but still a board member, she began quietly campaigning to reverse the internal review's findings, calling individual homeowners, framing the whole situation as one overzealous county employee with a personal vendetta against volunteer HOA leadership. She meant Patricia now, too. Patricia laughed. Genuinely, when I told her about that framing. She'd handled dozens of easement disputes over her career, none involving me personally before this one, and had no reason to hold any grudge against a volunteer HOA president she'd never even met before this case began. Debbie's calls mostly went nowhere. Most residents had already seen the documentation for themselves. In the group chat, in the meeting minutes, in Cheryl's forwarded email thread. There simply wasn't a version of this story left to spin that hadn't already been publicly, thoroughly contradicted by Debbie's own paper trail. Undeterred, Debbie escalated in a way none of us saw coming. She filed a formal complaint against me personally with the county, alleging I'd obstructed HOA operations and conspired with a county employee to manufacture the easement dispute, naming Tom and Patricia as co-conspirators in what she called a coordinated attack. Patricia forwarded me the complaint, more amused than alarmed, noting that alleging a conspiracy between a homeowner, a county recorder's clerk, and a semi-retired surveyor to fabricate a decades-old recorded easement was, professionally speaking, one of the stranger claims she'd encountered in her 15 years with the county. The complaint was reviewed and dismissed within a week, the reviewing officer noting that the easement document predated my home purchase by over 2 decades and that Tom's professional involvement had been documented, time-stamped, and cross-verified independently before any contact between us regarding the bridge had ever occurred. Debbie, apparently unwilling to accept the dismissal, escalated further still, showing up unannounced at the county public works office demanding to speak with Patricia's supervisor directly, insisting the entire investigation be reopened and reassigned to someone without personal ties to the homeowner in question. The supervisor, according to Patricia, listened patiently, reviewed the file summary, and told Debbie plainly that the finding wasn't personal, it was documented. Fabricated authorization emails, an unlicensed contractor, missing board approvals, and a decades-old recorded easement don't require personal animus to add up to a clear conclusion. Debbie left the county office, according to witnesses in the waiting area, visibly furious, loudly stating she'd take this to the state level if she had to. Patricia told me this with a tired sort of amusement, noting that state oversight bodies rarely intervened in cases this thoroughly documented at the local level. Back in the neighborhood, Debbie's remaining allies on the board began distancing themselves publicly. Even the one board member who'd voted against the recall issued a quiet statement to the HOA newsletter clarifying his vote had been about process concerns, not an endorsement of Debbie's underlying conduct regarding the bridge. I started to feel, watching all this unfold, less like I was fighting Debbie and more like I was simply standing still while the consequences of her own choices caught up to her one by one. Every escalation she attempted seemed to only strengthen the case already built against her. Sarah pointed out something I hadn't fully considered. Debbie's need for control had become, ironically, the exact thing exposing her. A person who'd simply admitted the mistake early, apologized, and worked with the county in good faith might have faced a fraction of the consequences now stacking against her. Tom agreed, mentioning he'd seen this dynamic before in his career. People who escalate every accountability moment into a battle rarely realize that each new battle generates its own new evidence. Debbie's conspiracy complaint against us, once dismissed, became one more documented example of her pattern under review. The internal HOA review committee, now operating with Ron as president, requested that Debbie's conspiracy complaint against me and its subsequent dismissal be formally added to her personal conduct file, given its relevance to ongoing questions about her judgment and honesty in official HOA-related matters going forward. Debbie responded to that request with a lengthy, emotional letter to the full board, accusing them of turning against the very person who built this community's standards from nothing, and warning that removing her influence entirely would lead to property values collapsing within a year. Nobody responded to the letter. At the next open meeting, a resident named Priya, who'd never spoken publicly before, stood and said she'd moved into the neighborhood specifically because of its friendly reputation, not its enforcement culture, and that Debbie's version of standards had made her afraid to plant flowers without checking a rulebook first. Several other residents nodded along, and one by one, quiet stories started surfacing that hadn't made it into any group chat before. A fence stain color dispute, a mailbox flag violation, a holiday inflatable fine issued during a hospital stay. Debbie's version of leadership had left small scars all over the block. Debbie sat through all of it without much visible reaction, taking notes on a legal pad the way she always had during meetings, as if she were still the one in charge of documenting everyone else's failures rather than finally hearing her own laid out, one story at a time. After the meeting, I overheard Ron telling another resident that the board was now drafting formal conduct standards for officers, specifically designed to prevent any single person from unilaterally authorizing spending, demolition, or enforcement actions without documented board approval going forward. Debbie's tenure had become the cautionary case study behind it. I felt a strange kind of closure hearing that, not because Debbie herself was being punished exactly in that moment, but because the system that had let her operate unchecked for years was finally being rebuilt to prevent the next Debbie, whoever that might eventually be, from doing the same thing. That same week, Debbie's lawyer requested another settlement conference with the county, apparently under pressure to resolve the restitution matter before it escalated to a formal civil judgment. Patricia said the offer on the table now included a structured payment plan, still substantial, still entirely Debbie's personal responsibility to bear. Debbie, according to her own social media post shortly after, framed the settlement as resolving a bureaucratic misunderstanding amicably. Patricia, reading the same post later, laughed again and said, "That's one way to describe personally owing the county tens of thousands of dollars for an unauthorized demolition." I decided, around this time, to stop checking Debbie's public posts entirely. Watching her reframe every consequence as some kind of misunderstanding had stopped feeling satisfying and started feeling exhausting. I had a family, a torn-up creek bank, and an actual restoration process to focus on instead of her narrative management. Ron reached out personally, asking what I hoped to see happen with the physical bridge itself going forward, now that the county's restoration process was underway. I told him honestly, I didn't need it to be exactly what it was before. I just wanted Lily to have somewhere to fish again. Patricia mentioned the county's restoration plan would include rebuilding the drainage crossing to modern code, likely sturdier and safer than the original, funded through Debbie's court-ordered restitution once finalized. There was something quietly satisfying about the idea that Debbie's own mistake would ultimately pay for something better than what she destroyed. Debbie, in what would turn out to be her final major escalation, attempted one more move, quietly proposing at a board meeting that the HOA sue the county itself for improper jurisdiction claims over the easement, apparently hoping to reopen the entire legal question from a new angle before restitution finalized. Ron, now firmly in charge and no longer willing to entertain Debbie's theories without scrutiny, asked asked the board's own legal counsel to review the proposal before any vote. Counsel's written opinion arrived within days, stating plainly that the easement's validity had already been independently confirmed through multiple decades-old recorded documents. Pursuing that lawsuit, counsel warned, would likely cost the HOA tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees with essentially no realistic chance of success, given the strength of the county's documentation. The board declined to bring the proposal to a vote at all, effectively ending Debbie's last legal maneuver. Debbie, sensing the board's patience had fully run out, stopped attending meetings for several weeks straight, sending Ron brief emails citing personal matters as her reason for absence. Linda mentioned, quietly, that rumors were circulating she might resign from the board entirely rather than face further scrutiny. I found myself, oddly, not particularly interested in whether Debbie resigned or not by that point. The restitution was moving forward. The internal conduct standards were being rewritten. The neighborhood's trust in its own systems was slowly rebuilding itself. Meeting by meeting, without needing Debbie's presence to validate any of it. Sarah asked if I'd ever want an actual apology from Debbie, given everything that had happened. I told her I used to think I would, but somewhere over these past months, that need had quietly faded. What I actually wanted, restoration, accountability, a fixed system, was already happening without one. Patricia called with confirmation that Debbie's settlement with the county had been finalized. A structured restitution plan spanning several years, covering the full restoration cost plus investigation expenses. It was, Patricia noted, one of the more thorough personal liability outcomes she'd seen in an unauthorized demolition case in her career. The HOA board, separately, voted to formally reprimand Debbie and strip her of all remaining committee assignments, though her general board seat technically remained until the next scheduled election. Per bylaw term limits, nobody had bothered updating for exactly this kind of situation until now. Debbie submitted her resignation from the board 2 weeks later, in a brief email to Ron that offered no apology, only a short line about stepping back to focus on personal matters. Linda forwarded it to me with a single line of her own. Well, that's that, I suppose. I read Debbie's resignation email twice, waiting to feel something bigger than I did. Mostly I just felt tired, in the good way, like setting down something heavy I'd been carrying for months without fully realizing its weight. Sarah hugged me when I told her. Lily asked if the bridge was coming back yet. The county's restoration crew arrived on a bright Saturday morning in early spring. A real licensed contractor this time, with actual permits posted visibly at the site, actual erosion control measures staged along the bank, and an actual inspector from Patricia's office overseeing every stage of the work. I stood at the property line watching them work, feeling none of the tension I'd felt watching Debbie's crew tear the old bridge down months earlier. This felt different, slow, careful, official, the exact opposite of that rushed, unauthorized morning that had started this entire saga in the first place. Tom stopped by that afternoon, watching the new footings get poured with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd spent his whole career caring about exactly this kind of careful, documented work. "This is how it's supposed to look," he said. "Slow. Nobody breaking anything they don't own." Cheryl and Alan came by too, along with a handful of other neighbors who'd become unlikely allies over the past several months. We ended up grilling burgers in my backyard while the crew worked, an impromptu gathering that felt less like celebrating Debbie's downfall and more like celebrating something rebuilt correctly. Patricia visited in person for the first time since this all began, walking the site personally to sign off on the final inspection. She told me, off the record, that cases like this rarely resolved this cleanly, and that Tom's early documentation had genuinely made the difference in how fast it moved. I thanked her, and Tom, more times than either of them probably wanted to hear, but I meant every one of them. Without Tom's early notebook entries and Patricia's willingness to prioritize my file, this could have dragged on for years, or never resolved at all, buried under Debbie's confident paperwork. The board, now fully reorganized under Ron's leadership, invited me to a public meeting to formally acknowledge the resolution and outline the new conduct standards preventing any future officer from unilaterally authorizing demolition, spending, or enforcement without documented board approval and, where relevant, verified county sign-off in writing. I stood up when asked, not for a victory lap, but to say something I genuinely believed, that this had never been about tearing anyone down personally, only about making sure the systems meant to protect a neighborhood couldn't be quietly bent by whoever happened to be the loudest, most confident voice in the room. Linda, sitting near the front, nodded through most of what I said, and afterward told me privately that she wished the board had asked harder questions years earlier, long before any of this reached the point of demolition trucks and county lawyers. I told her that was exactly why the new standards mattered now. Gary approached me too, quieter than usual, admitting he'd known something felt off about Debbie's confidence for a while, but hadn't wanted to be the one to challenge her directly. It's easier to go along with someone who sounds certain, he said, even when certain isn't the same as right. That comment stuck with me for days afterward. So much of what had happened traced back to exactly that, a room full of reasonable people deferring to one person's certainty, again and again, until the gap between her confidence and her actual authority grew wide enough to destroy something that never should have been touched. The new bridge was finished by early June, sturdier than the original, built to modern code, funded entirely through Debbie's ongoing restitution payments to the county. Lily stood on it the first afternoon it opened, dropping a line into the creek exactly like she used to, as if no time had passed at all. Sarah cried a little, watching her out there. I did too. Honestly, though I kept it to myself for a minute before admitting it. It wasn't really about the wood and nails. It was about watching something small and personal get destroyed by someone else's need for control, and then rebuilt anyway. Word around the neighborhood was that Debbie had moved out entirely by midsummer, listing her house quietly through a real estate agent rather than the usual neighborhood grapevine, and relocating to a different county altogether. Nobody seemed particularly surprised, and honestly, nobody seemed particularly sorry to see the listing sign go up. Patricia mentioned, in one of our last calls related to the case, that she'd flagged Debbie's file internally in case any future property transactions ever required disclosure of the ongoing restitution obligation, a small bureaucratic footnote that would follow Debbie quietly for years, regardless of which county she eventually settled in next. I asked Patricia once, near the end of everything, whether cases like this were common. She said no, not really. Most HOA overreach disputes settled quietly, informally, long before reaching a formal county enforcement action. What made this one different, she said, was simply that nobody involved had backed down from documenting the truth. Tom, for his part, never asked for any credit publicly, though I made sure everyone in the neighborhood knew how much his quiet, careful notebook had mattered. He just shrugged it off each time, saying he'd only done what any decent surveyor would do when he noticed something clearly wrong on the ground. The HOA's new conduct standards eventually got formalized into the governing documents themselves, requiring any enforcement action involving structural removal, common adjacent land, or expenditures above a modest threshold to require documented board approval and, where applicable, written confirmation from the relevant government authority before any action could be taken. Ron told me, months later, that the standards had already prevented one smaller dispute from spiraling. A new board member had wanted to fine a resident over a fence color without board review, and the new rules simply didn't allow it to move forward without proper documentation this time. I still think about that Tuesday morning sometimes, watching those sledgehammers swing into wood that wasn't even Debbie's to destroy. At the time, all I felt was helpless anger. Looking back now, I recognize it as the exact moment her carefully built authority finally started cracking apart. Piece by piece.
Plank by plank.
Debbie never did apologize. Not to me. Not to Lily. Not to the neighborhood she'd claimed for years to be protecting. I've made a kind of peace with that. Some people never fully reckon with what they've done, no matter how clearly the consequences eventually catch up to them in the end. What matters more to me now is what got rebuilt in the aftermath. Not just the bridge itself, sturdier and safer than before, but the neighborhood's own quiet. Understanding that no single person's confidence should ever outweigh the actual facts, the actual authority, or the actual documented truth of a situation. Sarah and I still walk out to the bridge most evenings, watching Lily cast her line into the same creek she's fished since she was small enough to need help holding the pole. It looks almost exactly like it used to, except now it belongs, officially and permanently, right where it should. Cheryl and Alan still stop by sometimes, along with a few other neighbors who became genuine friends through all of this. An unlikely community forged out of a shared, quiet refusal to just let one person's overreach go unchallenged simply because challenging it felt exhausting and uncertain at the time. Tom still jogs past most mornings, notebook long since retired from this particular case, though he told me once he still carries one out of habit, just in case. You never know, he said, smiling, when someone's going to need a second set of eyes on something everyone else assumed was fine. I think about Ron's line from that parking lot conversation more than almost anything else from this entire ordeal, that the board had simply let Debbie be the only one who ever talked to the county directly, for years, without anyone else checking her word against the actual record. That single, quiet failure of oversight, more than any individual act of cruelty or control, is what let this entire situation grow as large as it did. Debbie didn't need extraordinary power to cause this much damage. She just needed nobody else in the room willing to double-check what she claimed. It was a Thursday evening, almost a year after the demolition, when the last of it finally caught up with her all at once. The HOA newsletter went out that morning announcing the board election results, confirming Ron as permanent president with the highest resident approval rating in the association's recorded history. That same afternoon, Patricia called with news I hadn't expected. Debbie's restitution case, still active despite her move out of county, had been escalated after she missed 2 consecutive structured payments, triggering an automatic review clause the original settlement agreement had quietly included for exactly this scenario. The county attorney's office, Patricia explained, was now pursuing a judgment lien against Debbie's new property, a legal mechanism that would attach the remaining restitution debt directly to any future sale of her home, ensuring the county recovered its costs regardless of how far Debbie tried to distance herself from Willow Creek. I hadn't realized, until that call, how thoroughly the settlement had been structured to prevent exactly this kind of quiet evasion. Patricia said the county had seen similar cases before, where someone simply moved and stopped paying, assuming distance alone would make the obligation disappear. It rarely worked that way anymore. That same evening, Cheryl forwarded me a local news segment from Debbie's new county, A short human interest piece about neighborhood associations gone wrong, apparently prompted by a resident complaint in her new development. Debbie, turned out, had already tried joining the HOA board there within months of moving in. The segment didn't name her directly, citing an ongoing personnel matter, but described a new board member removed within weeks after residents raised concerns about aggressive, unauthorized enforcement actions eerily similar to everything Willow Creek had already lived through. Old habits, apparently, hadn't traveled far behind her at all. I watched that clip 3 times, feeling something complicated settle in my chest. Not quite satisfaction, not quite pity, something closer to recognizing a pattern too deeply set to simply move away from. Debbie hadn't learned anything from Willow Creek. She just found a new neighborhood that hadn't learned about her yet. Sarah pointed out something important when I told her, this wasn't really our problem to solve anymore. We'd done what we could, documented everything honestly, let the actual systems work the way they were supposed to. Whatever happened in Debbie's new county was between her and that community now. Still, I felt compelled to send Patricia everything I had, one last time, in case her new county's officials ever reached out looking for background. Patricia said she'd already anticipated that possibility and had proactively shared a summary of our case. At the new county's request, once Debbie's name surfaced in their records, that detail felt like the quiet, procedural version of a full circle. The same careful documentation that had freed Lily's bridge from Debbie's control was now, almost automatically, protecting some other family in some other neighborhood from repeating the exact same nightmare we'd lived through over the past year. 2 weeks later, Ron forwarded the board an update from the county attorney's office confirming the judgment lien had been formally filed against Debbie's new property. Whatever happened next in her new neighborhood, whatever board seat she chased or lost, that debt would follow her, attached and undeniable, until fully paid. The bombshell nobody expected came the following month, when Patricia called with news that Debbie's new HOA, independently investigating its own removed board member, had uncovered something during their review, records suggesting Debbie had misrepresented her prior HOA experience entirely, omitting Willow Creek's recall vote from her application altogether. More than that, the new HOA's attorney, doing basic due diligence after the community complaints, had found the Willow Creek case referenced in a regional HOA governance newsletter that had picked up our story as a cautionary example, complete with enough detail that Debbie's identity became impossible to hide from her new neighbors. Cheryl sent me the newsletter piece herself, genuinely surprised to see our neighborhood story summarized for a wider regional audience. The fabricated county authorization, the unlicensed crew, the recall vote, all laid out as a case study in why HOA boards needed stronger internal checks before granting anyone unchecked authority. Seeing it in print like that, stripped of names but unmistakably our story, felt strange in a way I hadn't expected. Something that had consumed nearly a year of our lives, one letter and one meeting at a time, had become a lesson other communities were now studying to protect themselves. Debbie, according to the same news outlet that had run the earlier human interest piece, issued a brief statement to her new community denying any wrongdoing at her previous HOA and calling the newsletter's coverage one-sided and incomplete. Nobody in her new neighborhood, apparently, found that explanation particularly reassuring anymore. Her new HOA board, per the follow-up article, voted to permanently bar her from holding any future officer position within the association, citing the pattern uncovered in their review alongside the ongoing county restitution case still actively attached to her name and property in 2 separate jurisdictions now. I read that final development sitting on our new bridge one evening, Lily's fishing line drifting quietly in the current beside me, and felt something I hadn't, expected to feel after everything, not vindictive satisfaction exactly, but a settled, grounded sense that the truth, given enough time, really does tend to surface. Sarah joined me out there a few minutes later. Sitting on the railing, Lily still wasn't quite tall enough to lean over comfortably, and asked if I finally felt like this whole ordeal was over. I told her honestly that I thought it was, not because Debbie had changed, but because we'd learned, over the course of a single destroyed bridge and everything that followed, exactly how much unchecked confidence can cost a community that simply assumes good faith without ever asking for proof. That lesson, more than any restitution payment or recall vote, felt like the thing worth carrying forward from all this. The HOA's new conduct standards, meanwhile, had already started attracting attention from neighboring associations, a few of whom reached out to Ron directly asking for copies of the language once word spread through local property management circles about how the whole situation had ultimately been resolved and prevented from recurring. Ron, never one to seek the spotlight, simply shared the documents freely, saying if it helped even one other neighborhood avoid what Willow Creek had gone through, that alone made the past year's exhausting meetings and difficult conversations feel like they'd actually accomplished something lasting beyond just fixing one bridge. Linda eventually stepped down from the board too. Not in disgrace like Debbie, but simply exhausted after years of quietly enabling a dynamic she'd only fully recognized once it had already caused this much damage. She told me once, honestly, that she wished she'd asked harder questions years earlier. I told her what I'd started telling most people who asked me some version of that same question by now. Hindsight makes every warning sign obvious after the fact. The real test isn't whether you missed something early on. It's whether you're willing to fix it once you finally see it clearly. Gary stayed on the board, quieter now, more willing to ask uncomfortable questions before votes rather than after damage was already done. He told me once that watching this whole situation unfold had permanently changed how he approached any decision where one person's confidence outpaced the actual documentation behind it. Alan and Cheryl both eventually joined the board themselves. In the next election cycle, part of a slate of newer, more skeptical members determined to keep the association's new conduct standards firmly in place long after the immediate memory of Debbie's tenure had faded into neighborhood legend rather than open wound. Tom retired fully from his consulting work not long after the case closed, though he still jogs past our house most mornings, still stops occasionally to check on the new bridge's footings out of old habit, still insists he was just doing his job even when I try to properly thank him. Patricia, the last time we spoke, mentioned she'd started using our case, anonymized, as a training example for newer recorder's office staff, teaching them how a small, patient act of prioritizing one homeowner's plat request had ultimately unraveled something far larger than anyone involved could have predicted at the outset. I've thought a lot, in the months since, about how close this all came to going differently. If I hadn't kept records, if Tom hadn't recognized those easement markers, if Patricia hadn't taken the time to actually look, any one of those small, careful choices missing, and Debbie might still be in charge. That thought used to unsettle me more than it does now. These days I mostly just feel grateful for Tom's notebook, for Patricia's patience, for Sarah's steadiness through months of stress, and for a daughter who never once stopped believing the bridge would come back. Even when I wasn't entirely sure myself. The county formally closed its file on the Willow Creek easement case that autumn. A full year and change after the demolition crew first showed up with sledgehammers and a piece of paper that never actually meant what Debbie claimed it did. Patricia sent me a copy of the closure letter as a courtesy. I framed it, actually, alongside a small photo of the original bridge Sarah had taken years earlier, back when none of this had happened yet. Back when a footbridge was just a footbridge instead of the thing that exposed exactly how much damage one person's unchecked certainty could do to a community. Debbie's restitution payments, according to the last update Patricia shared with me, continued on schedule through the judgment lien attached to her new property. A slow, steady, entirely impersonal mechanism that would keep collecting what she owed regardless of whatever new community she tried, and apparently kept failing, to control next. I don't know what happened to Debbie after that final news segment, and honestly, I stopped checking. Some stories don't need a final chapter delivered directly to you. Sometimes it's enough to know the systems worked the way they were supposed to, even if it took far longer than it should have. What I do know is what happened to us. A bridge rebuilt sturdier than before. A neighborhood with real conduct standards instead of one person's whims. And a daughter who still fishes off that bridge every summer evening, completely unaware of how close it came to never coming back at all. Sarah and I still laugh, sometimes, about how calmly I told that demolition crew to keep going that first morning. Phone already recording, while she stood beside me convinced I'd lost my mind entirely. You just knew, she says now. I tell her honestly, I didn't know anything yet. I just refused to fight blind. That instinct, more than any specific piece of evidence, ended up mattering most. The decision to document everything calmly instead of escalating emotionally in the moment. To let the facts build themselves methodically instead of trying to win an argument Debbie had already decided. In her own mind, she couldn't lose. Looking back at all 260 mornings, meetings, phone calls, and quiet porch conversations that led here, I keep returning to one simple truth. Debbie never lost because someone finally beat her. She lost because the truth, patiently documented, eventually outlasted every story she tried to tell instead of it. Ron mentioned, near the end of his first full term as president, that he still keeps a printed copy of the Internal Review Committee's original findings in his desk drawer, not as a trophy exactly, but as a reminder of exactly how fast unchecked confidence can rebuild a whole community's worth of trust into rubble. The board now requires, per the standards born directly out of this case, that any resident facing enforcement action receives written confirmation, with named authority, and contact information, before any physical action can be taken on their property or on adjacent common or county land under any circumstances whatsoever going forward. I sat on the new board myself, eventually, for one term, mostly to help finish rewriting the compliance procedures alongside Ron, Gary, Cheryl, and Alan. It felt less like reclaiming power and more like closing a loop, making sure the next homeowner who disagreed with an HOA decision never had to fight this hard. Lily, older now, sometimes asks about the story behind the bridge when new neighbors move in and notice the small brass plaque near its railing, quietly installed by the board, listing the date of restoration and nothing else. She tells them, simply, the county built this one. It's the good one. I never corrected her framing of it, because in a real sense, she's right. The county did build this one, properly, permanently, with permits and grading plans and an inspector who actually checked the work before signing off. It stands there now as proof that the right process, followed honestly, actually holds weight. Debbie's old house changed hands twice more in the years since she moved away. Each new owner blissfully unaware of the small legal footnote still technically attached to a different property entirely, still quietly collecting payment, entirely unconnected now to the quiet cul-de-sac where all of this originally began. Patricia retired from the county recorder's office 2 years later, and at her small retirement gathering, Tom joked that our case had probably added a few gray hairs to her otherwise routine career of plats and easements. She laughed and said honestly, it was one of the ones she was proudest of closing correctly. I think about that phrase sometimes, closing correctly. Not closing quickly. Not closing quietly. Not closing in whatever way was easiest for the people with the most confidence in the room. Just correctly, according to what the record actually showed, regardless of how loudly anyone insisted otherwise along the way. Sarah and I still walk out to the creek most evenings. Even now, long after the case files closed and the newsletter articles faded from anyone's memory but ours. It's just a bridge again. The way it always should have been, no compliance letters, no clipboard photos, no fabricated county emails behind it. Lily's grown taller than the railing now, casting her line further out into the current than she ever could as a little girl. She doesn't remember much about the demolition itself, just that there was a bad year, and then a good bridge, and that her dad kept a lot of emails for some reason. I've told her the full story a few times since, in pieces appropriate to her age, mostly because I want her to understand something simple underneath all of it, that being calm doesn't mean being passive, and that the quietest, most patient response to unfairness is often the one that actually wins in the end. She asked me once if I was ever scared, watching that crew tear the old bridge apart while everyone stood around filming instead of stopping it. I told her honestly, yes, I was scared. But I was also certain, somewhere underneath the fear, that letting it happen fully was the only way to prove it shouldn't have. The neighborhood itself feels different now. Lighter somehow, though the change is hard to point to directly. Fewer compliance letters. Fewer clipboard walks to each other instead of documenting each other for the board's next enforcement cycle. It took losing something to relearn what a community was for. Ron still serves on the board occasionally, mostly in an advisory role now, helping newer members understand why the conduct standards exist in the first place. Since most residents moving in today have no idea, a single obsessive HOA president once tried to control a creek she never legally had any claim to. Linda moved away eventually too, unrelated to any of this, simply chasing a job opportunity in another state. Before she left, she told me she was grateful the whole ordeal had happened while she was still on the board, even though it was exhausting, because it taught her what real oversight actually requires. I still keep that original folder of emails, backed up in 3 places out of old habit, even though the case has been closed for years now. Sarah asks sometimes why I haven't deleted it. I tell her some things are worth keeping, not out of anger, but as proof it really happened. The bridge itself has weathered a few winters now. It's new wood slowly aging into the same warm gray the old one wore before Debbie's crew tore it apart. On a Tuesday morning that once felt like the worst day of that whole difficult year, and eventually became the day everything started turning around. What began as a fight over 50 feet of wood and a strip of easement land became, somehow, a small lesson the entire neighborhood carries forward now, that unchecked confidence isn't the same as authority, that documentation outlasts intimidation, and that patience, given enough time, tends to outwork even the loudest certainty. Debbie never came back to Willow Creek. Not once. Not even to see the new bridge standing exactly where the old one used to be. Sturdier, permitted, and entirely out of her reach for good. I don't think she needed to see it. The neighborhood had already moved on without her. As for me, I still stand at that railing most evenings, watching Lily fish the same water she always has, and I think about how the whole thing started with a sledgehammer and ended with a brass plaque. Proof that sometimes the calmest response to an injustice is simply letting the truth catch up.